All right, well, it's chapter 6. There's definitely a lot of folks that we're missing, but if they don't end up joining us, hopefully they're able to watch this after the fact, since it will be recorded. So wanted to, on behalf of the University of California Riverside Alumni Association, thank you all for tuning in today for our virtual homecoming lecture with Dr. Aaron Seitz, as he shares with us more about the UCR Brain Game Center. My name is Brock. I'm the Director of Young Alumni Engagement with the UCR Alumni Association. Homecoming is historically a time for Highlanders from all over to come together on campus and community. But this year, we're bringing the festivities to you from the safety of your own homes. We're excited to be hosting a week's worth of events to connect students, alumni, parents, faculty, and staff. By moving all our events virtual, we're able to bring homecoming to Highlanders all over the world. So no matter where you're joining us from, we hope you have a happy homecoming week and are glad that you chose to join us for what we hope will be an insightful event tonight. For your reference, this webinar will be recorded and distributed after it concludes. While we do have some prepared questions towards the end after Aaron finishes with his discussion, we want to hear from you too. So you can submit your questions in the chat box at the bottom of the screen. We'll try to get to as many of your questions as we can at the end of the session. But at this point, I'd love to toss it over to Dr. Aaron Seitz to go on and start sharing about the UCR Brain Game Center. Thanks for joining us, Aaron.
Yeah, thanks for having me, and good evening to everyone. Hope that you're enjoying our COVID homecoming. It's a different experience for everyone. So with this talk, I wanted to kind of introduce people to the full name is University of California Riverside Brain Game Center for Mental Fitness and Wellbeing. And so we're a somewhat unique center, not just on the UCR campus, but also across universities. And so the first part of the talk, I'll tell you a little bit about some of the things we do. And the second part of the talk, I'm going to talk about one of the studies that we're doing that is kind of a large national study on working memory training. And so the first thing about the UCR Brain Game Center is that our mission really is to do principled research to design, test, and disseminate kind of evidence-based approaches, both to understand and to train brain fitness. And our goal really is to do things in such a way that they impact real life activities. And I'll talk more about this as we go through the talk. But what this slide is trying to show is that even though a lot of our kind of early work starts looking at vision and hearing, or we'll talk about working memory quite a bit, we're really trying to take a whole brain approach and look at what are the things that we know about neuroscience and psychology that can help inform anything that the brain does. And this goes beyond just basic cognitive skills, but things like language, emotion regulation, happiness, and well-being. And taking a look at our current projects, one thing which is really exciting is that over the last 4 or 5 years as we've been a center, we've made a lot of progress where we now have about 10 federal grants that are funding our research. And our research ranges everything from education, where we have a current project with the EF Plus Math Association, where we're developing tests of executive functions that are trying to improve STEM learning with the focus of Black and Latinx communities. And so that's kind of one range of early life, trying to do assessments to be able to understand what are individual needs of children and how to teach them better. Similar types of work we do in workplace. So for instance, we've been working with some warehouses and factories of how can we also measure aspects of people's cognition and use that to be able to promote better productivity, safety, and well-being. And that it's a similar type of issue, is that you think about, each day, not only do you have aspects of your cognitive abilities that you think as constants, they're also fluctuating. Some days you're more attentive than others. If we're able to measure this in the workplace, we might be able to help suggest what might be more safe and less safe activities. And the school, this might promote, what are better things to focus on in terms of lessons, or worse, given ups and downs at different days. With aging, we have other projects that are both looking at measurement. So we have projects looking at how can we better measure people's cognitive abilities as they age. And based upon this, what might be the treatments they need. And then the other thing is, how can we intervene to be able to help? And so a lot of what I'll be talking about today will be focused on training, and that as cognition declines with aging, there's more hope of ways to ameliorate these by training vision or working memory. We're also looking at other skills. So we're developing a new set of hearing tests. So if you look at things like hitting hearing loss, about half of people who are complaining about hearing issues, they go to an audiologist and they do fine on the audiological exam. And the reason the audiological exam really tests how the ears work, not as much as how the brain works. And so we're developing tests that might be able to really take the half of the people who are not diagnosed well in audiology clinics and come up with procedures that will better understand their hearing. And I'll talk a tiny bit about that in a few minutes. We're doing work that looks at VR. We're helping people with low vision. We have a clinical trial right now on schizophrenia. And even things like cancer, we actually have a project of, can we train people to have better inhibitory control skills so that they're able to better adhere to diets and medication and things of that sort. And so kind of every year, we have a wider and wider profile of activities that we're taking on. And that, there's two really fundamental components of our research. One is brain training, which will be the majority of this talk. And the other, which I wanted to get to just a little bit, both in the last slide and the next few, is about brain testing. So one thing, when we first started, we were really focused on how do we train the brain to do things better. As we started trying to figure out how do we understand whether we succeeded, we realized that we needed to come up with more and more sensitive tests to be able to measure people's hearing or vision or memory. And that as we've been doing that, we've been realizing that these tests might actually be even more valuable than some of the training, because essentially the test allows us to be able to understand individual needs. Only some of those people will their need be the training that we create. And so that there's a whole possibility of diagnostic and assessment that we're working on, and that a lot of our grant funding is focused on. And just to give a sense of this, I kind of mentioned hearing a few minutes ago, and that one of the things that we've been doing is to somehow got muted. So we've been developing hearing tests to be able to, help understand people with hidden hearing loss. And one of the things that is important about this is if you take a audiological exam, this is kind of the setting. So typically you have a super expensive soundproof room where the patient is sitting. You have a highly paid audiologist who is in another room who's controlling what that patient is hearing. And then you have very sophisticated equipment to make sure that the exact sounds that they're trying to produce are played properly to that participant. And so on one hand, this has provided a lot of valuable testing of people's hearing abilities. At the same time, it's expensive and not very accessible. And one of the things that we've been looking at is with modern consumer technologies, a iPhone or an Android phone or iPad or other tablet, that these are made for consumer entertainment, which means they have very good sound systems, which means that a lot of things that used to be only within the audiological clinic, we could actually do on consumer devices. And so we've created this app that we call Portable Automatic Rapid Testing, so PART. And what this is basically a audiological kind of test battery that both has standard audiological tests, but also tests that address hidden hearing loss. And what's really nice about this is that this will run on a phone or a tablet. And what we've done is that, this it's a more complicated experiment than, I'm making clear, but essentially what we did is we tested people on a standard hearing test when they're in a soundproof room, like an audiological clinic, versus when they're just wearing consumer headphones and an iPad in my lab. And what we find is that the same people doing the test twice, once in the soundproof room and once in a standard room, have almost identical scores. So basically, this is just showing the correlation between the booth and with the iPad. And what this starts to show is that these tests we're developing will break these accessibility barriers. So people could, in principle, take tests like this at home on their own devices. And especially during times like COVID-19 and telemedicine being a primary source of healthcare for most, things like this could be potentially transformative. And we've been developing similar tests of how can we measure vision, how can we measure aspects of cognitive control, so working memory, your ability to inhibit distractors, switch between tasks, multitasking. And then the one other I want to highlight just for a moment is fluid intelligence. So for people who grew up in California and had to take the GATE test, basically that's a test of fluid intelligence. And so this is used for school placement all over the place. And, the task, looks kind of like this. This is what we call UCMRT, so the University of California Matrix Reasoning Test. And this is just one of the problems where on the left, what you see is that if you look across the rows or look down the columns, there is a logical consistency. And so what you need to do is, by looking across the rows and down the columns, figure out what is the missing piece in that lower right-hand side. And I'll give people a moment to see if they could figure out which of the ones kind of in those 8 choices on the right fills in that gap. And since I can't see audience reactions, I'll just assume everyone's raising their hand by now. By the way, this is a harder than average problem. And it's this single trapezoid. Because what this problem is, it's a logical OR problem. So basically, so what you're looking for is, as you go across, what is common in the two? And as you go down, what is common in the two? And so that gives you basically just the trapezoid. And so we developed this new test. It's a collaboration between UCR and UCI. And that what's nice is that UCMRT takes only 10 minutes as opposed to the Raven's Advanced Progressive Matrices, which is the standard test that is used all the time for IQ tests and job placement and you name it. Their test takes about 50 minutes. Our test correlates with theirs. Our test better predicts math, science, and reading and writing scores than does the Ravens. And also we have multiple versions. So with the Ravens, there's just one set. So if you take it twice, you're just doing the same problems again. We have it so that there's multiple versions, and then also you don't need an examiner because you need to be self-administered. And so, on one side of the scale, basic hearing tests, we're developing ones that can be, done outside the clinic. On the other side of the scale, things like IQ tests, we're also developing ones that, allow for, our free version is better than the expensive ones that people buy from Pearson's and other companies. So with that, I want to get a little bit to the brain training side of things, and that, this was our original focus. And so brain training is something that's been really exciting over the last, 10 or 20 years as we understand more about how the brain works. There's this possibility that we can take this knowledge and figure out how to exercise it and make it work better. And an analogy that often comes up is if you look at physical fitness training, before we understood the way that the cardiovascular system worked and muscle physiology, it wasn't nearly as good. I mean, so the athletes of today, can run faster, jump higher, go further than 100 years ago. And a lot of that is because we understood how the cardiovascular system worked and we could basically come up with better ways of training the body. The analogy is with neuroscience and psychology. As we understand these better, can we do the same thing and come up with, specialized training routines for the brain? And as I go through the talk, my answer is going to be, I think we can, but that it's easier said than done. So just because one tries doesn't mean that everything out there works that great. And so starting off with conventional approaches to brain fitness. For a long time, people have looked to crossword puzzles or taking Mensa classes and doing Mensa problems or Sudoku. The Simon game is one that I used to play as a kid. I even won a free pizza by doing really well in Simon once. And reading is another. And so all of these activities are thought to be things that promote brain fitness. And they might in some ways. But what has been studied a number of times is when you train people, especially relatively high functioning people, to do these tasks, they get better at those tasks, but it doesn't transfer to untrained activities. And so it doesn't really improve general cognition. It's like teaching to the test. At the same time, we've had like all these neuroscience inspired games, not just the ones we created at the Brain Game Center, but you have companies like, I'm sure that you've seen advertisement for Lumosity. They've been advertising on, TV, radio, all over the place for years. There's other companies like CogMed that basically sells things to families with kids with ADHD. There's anti-aging games, Elevate, Peak, Brain HQ. It seems like every few weeks, there's more of these companies that are popping up. And there's a big question of, do these things work? And a number of years ago, there was a consensus statement that came out from the Stanford Institute of Longevity and the Max Planck Institute of Human Development. And that their conclusion was two pieces. And I kind of highlight what I think are the most important parts of their statement. One is that, and this is about 4 years ago, is that there's no compelling scientific evidence to date that these do specifically when targeted toward older adults. And so on one hand, we have this issue where it's not clear that even these things that are being sold, often for a lot of money, do what they advertise. On the other hand, in red is the counter is that, we encourage continued careful research and validation of the field. And so this is something which is often the case for interventions, is that it's not even saying that things do or do not work at the time. It's that they haven't been studied well enough to be able to, if it works, to know for sure that it does. I mean, this is something that, right now, as we're waiting for vaccines, we see that you need to run large numbers of people to be able to get the right type of evidence to understand the effectiveness of the intervention. And as I get later in the talk, one of the issues is that lots of the studies that have motivated these companies are based upon not that much data. And so the evidence, isn't compelling, even though some of them might be okay. And what we need, and this is kind of one of the motivations of starting the Brain Game Center, is kind of research that really determines which things are effective, and then also, just as importantly, which things are not. And that one of the big concerns is this concern of specificity. And so I'm going to tell you about one of the common approaches of working memory training that will come up throughout this talk. And that is, there's a task called the Nbap Task, which is probably the most popular approach to training memory. And the way that this works is that you see a series of screens. So each of these, 6 black boxes is a different screen that you see in sequence. And in this task, and there's lots of variants of this, you're supposed to remember the location of that blue square. And it's called an N-back. And so if N is 2, so like a 2-back, you would need to be able to, with each item, say whether 2 items would go, the square was in the same location. So as you go across, when you get to the third box, I don't know whether you see my cursor, but here, this is the same as what was 2 items ago, so it's a target. The fourth one is not, because 2 back was the lower left, and this one is the upper center. We keep on going forward, it's not a target, and then the 6th one is a target again. And so each time you see a target, typically you just respond with some key. And so you could train people on this task for, often 10 or 20 days. And here's some data of different training lengths in college students. So this is data that was collected by Susan Yackey, who's a professor in the School of Education at UC Irvine and a collaborator of mine. And that what you see here is at the beginning, people could do the task at the 3 back. So this meant that they could remember what was 3 items ago, not just 2. Across 20 some days of training, you see that on average people are getting about to the 5 back. So now they can remember 5 items back. What's really impressive is that we've seen people get up to like the 15 back. So imagine you see these series of stimuli, and that each time you're able to say, oh yeah, 15 items ago I saw that, and do that consistently. So some people get to that level, most not. And the big question is, okay, you train your memory, you start getting much better. Then you go to the grocery store and you try to remember what you're supposed to get, and do you remember that? And this is kind of the quandary of the field. And the answer really has been sometimes, but not consistently. And so there's lots of evidence where people will do much better at this trained task. And so in one domain, memory might be getting better, but it's not necessarily getting better for their daily activities, which might be their inspiration for doing the training in the first place. And so a big focus of what we've been doing at the Brain Game Center is, can we make brain training games that really have real world impacts? And so I'm going to briefly walk you through a study that kind of was the founding study of the Brain Game Center. And that was kind of work that we did with perceptual learning, or in other words, in this case, vision training. And so, I'll sometimes give more details in this section of the talk. And so if people want to know more about this, just, send me a note and I could send you more information. But the basic idea for this work was that going back to, when I was a PhD student, I was really looking at the relationship between vision being collaboration of how the eye works. And so we want the optics of the eye to work well. So I'm wearing glasses because it better focuses light on the back of my retina. That's important for vision. But also how the brain works. Because if you have a stroke and you have damage to visual cortex, you go blind, even if your eye works just fine. And that with many people, there's evidence that the brain's part of the equation can be improved. And in fact, as we get older, that it's not just the eye which is losing its elasticity, but it's also the brain that is either being noisier or in other ways not responding as well to the visual input it's getting. And while we have, a multi-billion-dollar industry that is looking at glasses and contacts and laser surgery and all these different approaches to help the optics of the eye, there's really much less that is focused on the brain side of the equation. And so the field that I worked on actually for most of my career, long before I started the Brain Game Center, was this perceptual learning field, where what are the approaches that will lead the brain to be more efficient and how it reads out information from the eyes. And so the first approach that I had to making a brain game was this game called Ultimize. And so this is just showing a little video of the way the game worked, is that that little target is blowing up these stimuli that we call gabors. And these stimuli are special because there's tons of research showing that if you look at the early pathways of the visual system, neurons in primary visual cortex, so right in the back of my head, if I stuck an electrode in there and I recorded from neurons, that you would find that they really love these gabors. Some will like them when they're vertical, some horizontal, some where the lines are kind of wide, others why they're thin. And that there's a lot of research suggesting that the way that we see is the brain first breaks things down into essentially these Gabor filters, and then reassembles the images in some ways to what we actually see, which is pretty similar to when your phone, you take a picture and it compresses it, that it's also actually breaking it down to a similar set of filters. In fact, JPEG compression was modeled after what we learned about how the visual cortex functions with these kind of Gabor type filter systems. And so what we did with this game is that we trained people to find these Gabors when they're really hard to see. So here it's pretty obvious. But what we did is, as people play this game, we faded them out so they could barely see them. And that we were able to find was that people were able to get better at discriminating these after training. So half of what we wanted was, what would be something that might be a reasonable way to train vision? The other thing I said was that this real world part is important. And so we approached Doug Smith, who was the former coach of the UCR baseball team. And we convinced him to collaborate with us in a study where we trained the baseball team for about 30 days during the fall. And so this is basically the pregame season in the 2013-2014 school year. And then we're able to test their vision before and after this, and then also look at their on-field playing performance after the training. And so in terms of vision, what we found is you could see kind of towards the left, there's some bars above the word trained, and those are the hitters of the team. And so basically we found is that they had about a 30% improvement in distance vision. And then this untrained group was actually the pitchers. And so we also tested their vision before and after, and they didn't show any changes. And so this, like on an eye chart, would be on average getting from about 2013 to about 2010. And 7 of the athletes got down to like 27 and a half. And so what this means is what a normal person would need to read at 7.5 feet. They could stand 20 feet back and read. And so this is a pretty kind of impressive vision. And actually 6 of those 7 people got drafted that year. They're also college athletes. So we looked at reading. And so we found that reading speed also improved. So these are the types of things that I'd call like near intermediate transfer, because we're looking at how does improvement lead, how does training lead to improvement on tasks that are not exactly what is trained, but are kind of the same domain. We also looked at performance on field. And so we could see on the left is that there was kind of a 4.5% reduction in strikeouts in the Riverside team, which was statistically significantly different than a much smaller improvement in the Big West League as a whole. And then we started looking at some of the sabermetric measures. So like Bill James, Money Mall type approaches to understand baseball. And what we found was that UC Riverside had more runs created per out in the year after training than the year before. This was larger than the change we saw in the Big West League. We could subtract out the Big West League change and just look at the difference. And we could estimate that this led to a 4.7 game improvement, or games won, compared to what they would have if they just improved at the normal maturation rate for the league. And so this is kind of some of the first evidence, this small sample, that maybe we could get real world changes from these types of training. Moving on to memory, what we did is when we started the Brain Game Center, we started looking at these same approaches, but how can they help with other aspects of cognition? And memory is probably the biggest complaint that people have, especially as you get older. And so, it ranges from, trying to remember people's names, or where do you put your car, what should you get at the store, And for some people, it's just an annoyance. For other people, it's really severe that, makes it difficult to do your job, difficult to do activities of daily living. And what's really frustrating is you go to your doctor with a complaint about memory, and they might be able to kind of do some tests that will confirm, oh yeah, your memory's not that great, but there really are not acceptable treatments. There's some cases where maybe you have a drug imbalance and that, you might be able to get medication to help with that. Or, maybe diet and exercise will help a little bit, but we don't really have targeted treatments to improve memory. Going back to this Nbap task, this is one of the most standard approaches. And before I kind of showed you the graph on the left that shows that, you get task learning. What's interesting is that there's some evidence that things like this fluid intelligence, like that matrix reasoning task I showed you earlier in the talk, that could also get improved after you train working memory. And so this is another figure from Susan Yackey's research that shows that training on the working memory task gave rise to a small improvement, like a couple question improvement on the fluid intelligence test. But a control group that did not do the same training, had maybe a slight improvement and not nearly as much. And so, this would be exciting, but the issue is that the results differ across studies. And to show you like a super complicated figure, but I'll, explain the essence of it, is that we recently took 52 different studies that did Nbap training. And we tried to understand what can we learn from looking at all those studies together. And we ran into a problem. So what this figure is showing you is that kind of when you look at the numbers going around, what's showing is that each of these radii is a different study. And the different colors you see is that for the inner rings, those are showing each color is a different type of training. And so you can kind of see a key on the left, doesn't matter the details of it. But what we see is that people used very different training approaches. And that there's lots of different features of these trainings that varied. And so across all these 52 studies, there's only 7 studies that actually train the same thing. And then even more complicated is that if you go to the outer rings, so kind of, and there's a key on the right, is the outcome measures that people use differed. And so that what we found is that, when people are trying to see, did memory improve? Across the studies, there are 30 different tests of memory. Whether fluid intelligence improved, there's about 30 different tests of fluid intelligence. And so if every study uses different methods, we're left with this problem that we can't figure out where the evidence is reliable, because each study is kind of small and they're all inconsistent. Some of them find results that are transferred and others aren't. And unfortunately, we are kind of left with a mess. And so some of the key questions, that we've had is, well, like one, what training approaches are best? With all these different training types, it's probably not the case that they all have the same results. Some of them are probably better than others. Also, what outcomes are impacted by training? Because nothing when you get to cognitive training is, does it work or does it not? It's kind of what does it work for? Because maybe it only improves memory, but somebody's complaint was just about memory. Or maybe someone else, maybe a student, they care about an improving fluid intelligence. And so if it only improves memory, that's a failure. But there's also different domains in memory. And then also, what about diversity? I mean, do we really think that everybody's going to have the same results? So it's likely outcomes will differ across people and maybe in systematic ways. And then also, maybe not everybody benefits from the same type of training. Maybe it's not just which type of training is best, but maybe different types of training are better for different people. And so as we start to look into this, we've also started to extract out, what are some of the principles to improve working memory training. So one thing that I showed you earlier was that if you do this task where you just like have this colored square and you're supposed to remember where it shows up in the grid, would you expect training on that should improve all memory processes? I mean, you're really just looking at one small aspect of visual spatial memory. And so that it might be the case that if you want things to transfer, you need to use a range of stimuli. So different shapes, different colors, different sounds, you know, things that are, you know, very concrete and other things that are very abstract. You know, we apply memory to a lot of different things. Maybe we need a wider range of things in order to be able to have it transfer to a wider range of activities. And then also, not all memory tasks are the same. So if you start to break it down, you know, this Nbap task, you know, the focus is capacity. So how many things can you remember? But there's also what we call resolution. So Wei Zhang in the psychology department looks at these a lot, is that how well do you remember everything? And there's some trade-offs between how many things you can remember and how well you can remember them. Updating is a key thing of this Nbap task, is that when you need to remember something new, sometimes you have to get rid of something that's old. And so that this constant process of loading new information to memory and releasing other information is an important thing. Association is basically links between things. If you want to remember someone's name, you know, it's basically an association between a name and a face, or maybe a name and a sound these days. And each of these things is a different task structure. And then maybe we need to train on multiple types of tasks. And there's other things that might make training better. So reinforcement is a fancy word for reward. And so maybe we need to reward in specific ways or direct attention in the right ways. And then another thing I'll talk about a little bit is good design. And we're the Brain Game Center. So like one thing to think about is like these games, you know, one would think that they might be targeting reinforcement and design. And one of the key things that, you know, we saw in the literature before we got started is that more is not more. And this is something that, you know, we've probably all experienced. But this is an example, again, actually from Susan Yackey's lab, where they trained kids on a game that they thought would be more enticing to the kids. And so they had a first study where they basically stuck in all sorts of things. So they had themes and scores and levels, and you could get prizes. So if you did well, you could get a sticker and a certificate and all this stuff that was basically supposed to improve motivation. And then they later did a study of like, well, did these things really help? And so they started taking them out one by one. And the thing which is really impressive is that if you just look at training gain, this little bar on the left shows that with all the motivational features intact, the kids learn less than if none of the motivational features were there. And it's kind of amazing because like you think that all this stuff should help with the learning process. But the reality is that they're also all distractions. You think about the kid who's like, okay, I just got a point. So do I want a sticker of a frog, or do I want a sticker of a star or a ladybug? Oh, shoot, I just missed the next trial. And so one of the key things, you know, from the study is that, you know, they thought that these things should, you know, help the learning process, but they need to be put together in a way so that they actually are effective. The key thing is that you want attention to be drawn to the learning objectives. You want the learning objectives to be reinforced, not something that's separate from that. And so what we've developed, and I think we might see a video which hopefully has no sound, is kind of a number of different games. So this one in the upper left where you can see the spaceship is the first Nbap game we created. And so this one, they're doing it on the colors and the shapes of the objects. And so the spaceship is collecting all the items that don't match the Nbap rule. And then whenever something matches the 3-bap, it zaps it. And so this is a much harder task in some ways, but it does improve engagement. And we did a lot of work to try to make sure that attention would be properly focused to the things that we want them to learn, and that the reward was associated with kind of really closely to what they learned. And that if you look at these other boxes, like this Remember Bee is actually kind of the same game engine as the Space one, but we actually use this with older adults, where the Space one kind of seemed overwhelming. Having a bee pollinating flowers, seemed more gentle. In fact, actually, I kind of like that one more too. We have another game that we use called Recollect the Game, and I'll tell you in a little bit about Recollect the Study. And here, in addition to just the Nbap task, we have other tasks where people will have to remember flowers and as many as they can, but no longer updating, or some variants, they have these bugs where you have to basically remember the colors of the bugs, and then they turn their back so they're all gray. And you, as they fly around, you have to drag the right bug onto the right colored flower. And so what we're really looking at is how do we train with different stimuli? With some of them, they have sounds that help you with the tasks, and also different task structures to try to get more learning. And then also trying to have the game design so that it might be more effective. And so if we start looking at the first results from this, and this is still kind of early on, what we see is that in the blue curve in the middle, we have what we've been calling kind of the lame back, but it's just a non-gamified version of the Nbap task, where you're seeing, in this case, a series of colors, and you have to remember the color that you saw an item is back. And you can see that here, people start off a little bit, kind of 2 1/4, and they get about to 4. The full game, this is where you're navigating an astronaut and collecting the Nbap targets. We now are actually getting people up to the 5 back. And so we see that they're actually learning more than with non-gamified one. The skin condition is kind of interesting, is that it's basically just showing pictures of the game. So it's just like with the previous slide, the way that these themes were shown is that basically it's just a still. You see a picture of a frog in one place, you never see the frog moving. The next time you see a picture and the frog is in another place. And so it's artistically interesting, but it's essentially just distracting in that you have your color hidden in this visual morass of other information. And what we found was that actually people did worse than the non-gamified task. So we kind of replicate this other study showing that poor design for gamification leads to less learning, and that good design seems to lead to more learning. And the other thing we're looking at in these studies is different outcome measures. So near transfer is kind of like improvement on the training task, or maybe an untrained version of a very similar, like another Nbap task. That's where everybody finds learning, if they do things right. Intermediate transfer, this is, something like when I showed you the vision training and showed you improvement on the eye chart. You're looking at skills that are related. So maybe other tasks of working memory that use different stimuli and task structures than you trained on, or your ability to inhibit distractors or things of that sort. And so we have a bunch of tests of those. And then far transfer is another area of interest. It's like, help things that rely upon memory, like, math or reading comprehension or reasoning skills, fluid intelligence. And so what we're looking at in our studies is basically to have tests that will span these categories and try to figure out, really, where do we find only near transfer? Where do we find intermediate transfer? Where do we find far transfer? And then this kind of national working memory training study, and this is using a version of the program called Recollect the Study, is we're trying to recruit 30,000 people to participate in our research. And what we're doing is that they're randomly assigned to different training conditions. So some people will get the non-gamified task. Some people get the skin condition. Some people get the game condition. Some people have things that have both sound and visual stimuli that are part of the task. We have different adaptive algorithms. So basically we have a lot of different training variants that people will experience. We have all these outcome measures. And then our hypothesis is not, does it work or not? It's what we're trying to do is what types of training are going to lead to what aspects of transfer and for whom. And so for instance, we've already been finding that older adults that have trouble with distractors, they seem to learn better from the non-gamified task than the gamified task, as opposed to a college student, who's pretty good at dealing with distraction. They might get really bored by the non-gamified task, but learn a lot better from the gamified one. And so we don't actually have a view that any of these are necessarily better for everybody than anyone else. What we're really trying to understand is these individual differences. And that is also not saying that it's only success if you find transfer to fluid intelligence. For somebody who is concerned about their memory, improvement on memory is what they want. For somebody who has trouble memorizing parts of math problems, then they want something that is going to transfer to the math activities. And so, and the other thing, going back to my analogy with vaccines and such, is to answer these questions, we need a large number of people. And so one of the things that's actually a big struggle of ours is how can we find 30,000 people to participate in our study when essentially we could only reward them with prizes, because it would take a lot of money if we paid them by the hour for this. So some closing thoughts is that, this cognitive or brain training, it has a lot of potential, but the problem is the research to date has been lacking. And so even the things that might be working well, the evidence isn't clear that it's working well. We need to have approaches to understand things that moderate and mediate training. And what I mean by this is moderation is like, what are the individual differences? And mediation is like, how do the different training approaches interact with the individual differences to basically give rise to what might be personalized results, as opposed to looking at everything on average. And to do this, we need a large amount of data, and we really need to look at individual differences. And going back to that review paper I mentioned, we need to have common metrics across studies to be able to compare them well. But the results, can be really transformative to, education, medicine, workplace settings, et cetera. And so with that, I think I'm slightly over time, but it takes a large number of people to do this. And actually there's many more people who have contributed to this work than I'm showing in this figure. Although if you look on the left, that's Susan Yackey, who I keep on mentioning, as who did some of the work in the field. And also in the lower left, we have the baseball team, who really kind of helped us get the Brain Game Center started in the first place. And with that, I'd love to take any questions.
Yeah, thank you so much, Aaron. That was definitely really informative. And I know I learned a lot. It was really cool to learn about so many great things happening here on UCR's campus. We do have a few questions already. Just a reminder to folks on the call, if you do have questions, please submit them at the chat feature at the bottom of the screen, and we'll try and get to as many questions as possible. But the first question is, how do you use students in your lab?
So we typically have about 50 students working with us per quarter, and that they're involved pretty much in every aspect of what we do. So we have some students from computer science who help with programming. We have some students from art who help, drawing assets for the figures. We've had a graduate student from music who's composed music for us. We have lots of psychology students who will help run studies and, with data analysis and, ideas for new research. And we've had marketing students who kind of have helped us, whether recruit subjects or with some fundraising activities. Basically, without students, we'd be nothing.
Yeah, I didn't even realize that there'd be so many different aspects to this that students would be able to be a part of. If a student on the call is interested in helping out and maybe being involved, what would you suggest be the best method to go about doing that?
So you could either send me an email directly, or also on the Brain Game Center webpage, there's a link for participation, and that there's a form you could fill out to be a research assistant.
Cool. Really great to know. Hopefully some of our folks on the call may be interested in being more involved. Question 2, any thoughts on programs geared toward children's brain development, such as Baby Einstein?
So, I mean, it's really interesting in that things like Baby Einstein are kind of in this mix where I think they have a positive place, and at the same time, they tend to be overhyped. And so that, there's, some both kind of legal issues and kind of research papers that, have shown that the claims that Baby Einstein makes are not validated. At the same time, the basic concepts they have, like in terms of like, the stimuli that are interesting to babies and help exercise the visual system and such, those probably are okay. And it really just brings up this question of, like, what is the balance between things that might be helpful and, the hype that goes along with the sales of those products? And I think that we're in a field where, since there aren't really good solutions and we don't really know kind of which things work, the proper thing to do is to try things out with skepticism. So, don't spend a huge amount of money and don't eat because you're trying to get all the Baby Einstein products. At the same time, it's okay to try things out that might be beneficial if there's not an alternative cost associated with it. And so I think that, anything self-help, it's a matter of trying things out, seeing if they fit, and some of them might fit us. Some of them might really work, and some of them might just build our confidence while they're just the placebo effect, and that's okay too. But it's kind of a buyer be aware, is what I would say.
Yeah, no, I think that makes total sense, and definitely something I didn't even think of, but really helpful. Thank you. Question number 3 from our audience is, do you have recommendations for specific games to help with increasing executive function during traumatic brain injury recovery, especially once most basic cognitive function has been recovered?
So it's tough because this is an area where there aren't a lot of things that have been well validated. Like kind of going along the line of Baby Einstein, like Brain HQ. The company is Posit Science. It's kind of founded by a professor at UC San Francisco. They have tools, they've done studies for traumatic brain injury. The results seem okay. I don't think they hurt, provided that, the expense of them isn't a problem, but they're not proven either. Some of the things that we create, some of them would be too difficult, others would be okay. There's lumosity, it can't hurt. But the real thing is that what you want is something that is essentially, exercising the process involved. And so a card game like Set also might be okay. And it might kind of do the same thing. And probably what's most important is that you change these activities once kind of the learning becomes automatic. So that there's going to be a certain point where it's a new thing. And so that, the individual has to kind of learn the rules and there's some challenges. And there's a certain point where it might become rote and you might want to switch to another challenging activity. And the goal that we have for some of these brain games that we're creating is to try to make it so that that variety gets automatic in the game. But we're not there yet. Most other people aren't there yet. And so I think, for the next 5 or 10 years before some things get better, I think it's try out a few different activities and see which one seems to be working.
Yeah, great question, and thanks for answering that. We have time for one last question, and that is, can brain games help people of all ages? Is it more effective with some ages than others?
So I'd say that yes and yes. So we found that like this vision training helped the baseball team. And so these are really highly functioning individuals. Their vision was really good beforehand. They're doing constant work on these visually demanding tasks. But still, there's kind of an area where our training can help them out. And for them, basically just a tiny percent improvement. So like when I talk with Doug Smith, it's like, you make a 1% change, it's huge. And that's true, like in baseball. So you might find a small change, but it might be significant. When you go to a child, basically the earlier you go, the more opportunity there is for positive plasticity. And so this is true for all aspects of education. But training cognition is something that can be really helpful, and that depending upon how cognitively stimulating the child's environment is, that this type of brain training might be useless or transformative. As you age, same type of thing is that there, depending upon the individual, there might be a huge room to get them back to where they might have been before. Or with some older adults, they're just fine, and this training isn't going to help them that much.
Yeah, I think it makes total sense, and appreciate the great insight. That's all that we have time for today. A huge thank you to Aaron for joining us and for this great presentation and for answering our questions. On behalf of the University of California Riverside Alumni Association, thank you everyone here for joining us today for our virtual homecoming event. We appreciate you making time to be a part of today's event. I hope you've gained some valuable insight. Again, I'd like to thank Aaron for his time, generosity, and commitment to UCR and to the Brain Game Center and everyone else there that's doing such great work. The insights and advice you've shared today really make it a special part of being a part of the UCR community. To everyone on the call, you'll be receiving a follow-up email containing a recording of this webinar. We hope to see you at the rest of this week's homecoming events. So thanks everyone for joining, and happy homecoming.